There was an example, wasn't there, the other day, of one shipper ordered $2.5 million worth of tools from Europe, missed the tariff deadline because of the container being rolled numerous times, and got hit with 250 grand additional cost because of the tariffs. These aren't small, insignificant figures, are they? When we talk about tariffs, we do it all the time, don't we? We talk about tariffs, but when you actually hear those kind of real life examples, it really does hit home just what the financial implications are of this for businesses. Welcome to The Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. Because in this industry, probably now more than ever, every decision carries weight and the right conversation can change everything. Joining me for our usual slot in The Freight Debate is Emily Stausbøll, Xeneta Senior Shipping Analyst. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Phil. Let's get right into it. There's plenty of stuff going on.
There is. What was it, like 2 weeks since we did the last one? So again, plenty to talk about. What's happened in the meantime. Couple of topics that we've picked out to discuss in this episode of The Freight Debate. The first one, we're going to cover the impact of tariffs on freight rates, and more specifically, maybe why, if there's falling demand out of China, why we're not seeing more significant declines in freight rates than we are doing. And secondly, we're going to touch on port fees, but actually a bit of a development in that story in the past week, which is the Ships for America Act, which is another headache for shippers to deal with on top of everything else. Emily, should we start off with rates?
That is our bread and butter here at Xeneta, so absolutely. And I think the conclusion from just looking at the market averages would seem to be that not much is happening. We're seeing slight declines in spot rates from kind of where we were at the start of April, but by no means what we would expect, hearing about the significant demand drops out of China and then also increasing volumes out of some of the other countries as they front load. So suspiciously quiet, I think the freight rates are saying. But of course, there's plenty more to that than us being confused.
You analysts are a cynical lot generally, so let's tell me why. Tell me what's going on beneath the surface.
I think clearly the carriers have learnt their lessons from the pandemic, and they are able at the moment to use blank sailings to such an extent that they're managing to balance out demand and capacity, leading to basically flat freight rates out of China to the US, but also out of other countries in the region, be that Japan and South Korea or down in Southeast Asia. All those three trades are moving at the same kind of pace, which is surprising, right? We've got significant drops in demand out of China and increasing demand out of the others, but that's not reflecting on spot rates. Carriers have blanked almost a third of capacity from the Far East into the US West Coast, so that's huge. And at the moment, we don't have concrete data on the demand drops, but we've heard reports from some freight forwarders, from some carriers, also from the Port of LA, saying around about a 30% drop in volumes out of China is what we're looking at. And if you're then blanking around a third of capacity as a carrier, that does seem to balance the market in the simple overview of the situation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hell of a lot of capacity to be blanking, isn't it? Is this a normal thing for them to do?
Well, I was going to say normal, but this is not a response to a normal situation.
Yeah.
That being said, we've seen it once before. We saw it in the first few months of the pandemic, massive blanking of sailings as volumes out of China dropped, basically allowing freight rates to be flat until they really picked up. So later that year in 2020, we saw suddenly volumes pick up and spot rates start to spiral up to their highs in 2021 and 2022. So they seem to have realized that actually it worked that time. And again, we're looking at a situation that is similarly extreme to say, okay, we can use it again. And I think absolutely the carriers have learned from the past years since the pandemic that actually freight rates don't have to be linked exactly to supply and demand, the fundamentals, or their costs. This is a market where a lot of stuff influences it, and they're obviously trying to make the most money. And they saw how successful they were during the pandemic. Why wouldn't you try that again?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean to say I think it's guaranteed to work for them in the longer term, but they're definitely going to give it a go.
Yeah, the problem, I suppose, is that in the pandemic, they had that kind of short term, really significant drop in demand, but that was followed up by an extraordinary upturn in demand during the pandemic. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? The tariffs might be torn up, unlikely, but it's unlikely we're going to see that rebound in this scenario, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking about this, right? The reason we saw the pandemic explosion really in demand and freight rates was you had the US funding sort of demand side stimulus. The Americans generally got three checks worth several $1,000s, so they had more and more demand, but the US wasn't producing more. And actually, on the other side of the world, China, its stimulus was focused on that supply side and more production. So they kind of needed each other for their own stimulus plans to work, and that turned out very well. Here, there's a completely different it's a completely different situation. We definitely expect tariffs to move and be adjusted, but we're not expecting by any means to see that increase because the US economy simply isn't there for it, and we're still expecting higher tariffs to remain in place for Chinese goods.
Yeah, I mean, in the Xeneta platform, customers can get benchmark carriers against each other, but just as a general point, not all carriers will be blanking to the same level, presumably. So, are some carriers kind of more exposed to that kind of trans-Pacific trade? What's going on carrier by carrier level?
So let's take it up one level from carrier level and look at the alliances instead. Just and there it's clear if you take Far East to the US West Coast and it's similar into the East Coast, the Ocean Alliance is really leading the way. They have blanked about 50% of all the blanked sailings. That's what they're accounting for. And at the other end of the scale, you've got the Gemini Corporation that on the face of it hasn't blanked anything really, except for maybe one or two sailings, with MSC and the Premier Alliance falling somewhere in between. I think the Gemini Alliance in particular, the numbers are interesting. They have lowered a little bit the capacity they offer, but that's primarily been by switching in smaller ships rather than blanking sailings. There's potentially also a question about how they've set up this corporation, as they call it. It's very different to what we've seen in the past, with really this focus on the hub and spoke model, which may well, and I haven't looked into this deeper, but may well mean that they can kind of blank capacity remove it without explicitly saying we've blanked this service. In reality, your container might not be on the exact ship you thought it'd be on, but they have enough of a network between their hubs and with their shuttle services to make sure that actually what needs to be moved can be moved without that level of blank sailings officially.
Yeah, and they've got really lofty targets, haven't they, for schedule reliability? So, is it logical that if you can only blank so much that if you do too much, then your boxes are going to arrive late?
Yes and no. It depends how you're measuring schedule reliability. And I think this has been a topic for discussion with some of the Gemini Corporation's competitors. The Gemini Corporation says our ships will arrive on time 90%. That doesn't mean that your container is on board that ship.
Right.
And that's what some of those competitors would say. It's fine that this headline deep sea trade is 90%, but if your container isn't on board, what's that of use to you? I think the early numbers coming in, we are seeing Gemini getting up to that 90% and far outperforming its competitors, but we're far from having the full rollout. So that absolute number, we'll be looking at kind of July, August before we can really say, has this been successful or not? But that's a huge point. And when you blank sailings, we have spoken with customers who faced huge tariff bills because their container wasn't moved when they booked it to be moved. Yeah. Either because the ship arrived late and all the rest of it, or because it was blanked and it got delayed by a week. Yeah. And when you're talking about these huge tariff sums, that quickly costs. Yeah. And that's also one of the things to really bear in mind. Yes, they're blanking sailings, but you really need to understand, is my container going to get on the ship in time to avoid this huge bill?
There was an example, wasn't there, the other day, of one shipper ordered $2.5 million worth of tools from Europe, missed the tariff deadline because of the container being rolled numerous times, and got hit with 250 grand additional cost because of the tariffs. These aren't small, insignificant figures, are they? When we talk about tariffs, we do it all the time, don't we? We talk about tariffs, but when you actually hear those kind of real life examples, it really does hit home just what the financial implications are of this for businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And that example, it was just a few days that they really got that problem, and that is a huge bill to get and completely changes kind of the profit margins you can expect on those goods.
Yeah, right. So another question around blank sailings then. There are still so many ships in the world. So if you're blanking sailings on the Transpac, for example, those ships aren't just sitting in a port, presumably. They're moving. Where are they? What are they doing?
Yeah, so they're moving into new trades. A lot of them at the moment seem to be going into the Far East to Europe trades, where we're seeing, if not record high capacity, certainly pushing at those levels. And that also then filters down to different trades. It's happened time and time again. It's whether when freight rates are going up on one trade, carriers move their ships over there to get higher rates, driving up rates on the trade they left, and vice versa. Now they're leaving one trade and going to another one and pulling spot rates down. I think I'm a little bit surprised that at the moment we're not seeing a higher idle fleet. Uh, at the moment, the idle fleet, as we look at, we get numbers in from Alphaliner, is at about 0.5% of the total fleet. Now, those were numbers that are a couple of weeks old now, and presumably they will now be pushed up because I struggle to see that a trade or that the rest of the trades can fully absorb that. But I've been surprised before. I've been surprised that the idle fleet has stayed so low. It's basically been under 1% since January 2024. Of course, we still have the Red Sea, right, which we very quickly forget in these discussions, but is still a major factor in global container shipping. But at the moment, though, these ships all seem to be moving on to new trades. How long that lasts is a question mark. And then that sort of filters down onto the idle fleet, onto charter rates, and at the end of the day, also into demolition. At the moment, we still have very, very few ships being demolished because they're still earning money. But a significant drop in demand. Also, when we look past this kind of 90 days, when you presumably get the end of front loading from the rest of the world, because let's not forget the rest of the world is also with a deadline in early July, that then also potentially pushes it even further.
Unless there's some kind of change, unless there's some kind of change in the China-US tariffs. In other words, if for whatever reason Donald Trump is convinced, persuaded, comes to this conclusion by himself, whatever, and reduces that 145% tariff, is it now, down to, well, anywhere, I suppose, between 10% and 145%, we could see a pickup in demand, could we not?
We definitely could. And I think there's increasingly more and more shippers who are betting on a reduction in tariffs from China. And that seems to be getting more and more media coverage that this is a possibility. Of course, we don't know when and we don't know by how much. But we've heard some anecdotal stories of shippers kind of those who perhaps had paused their exports out of China in the immediate aftermath, saying actually let's pick some of them back up. Not everything, but just a little bit in the hopes that we then can get the tariff reduction. And actually that's one of the few places where you can see something on spot rates. Is if you compare spot rates into Seattle versus spot rates into Vancouver. And it seems that some shippers are trying to push, let's go to Vancouver, let's import that container there, not put it straight through customs, but let's leave it there and hope that by the time that at some stage those tariffs will be pulled down and they can then move the container in. And that's where we're seeing rates into Vancouver actually increase, whereas those into Seattle are falling to match that demand. And that's one part. Another option that people are looking to, but the capacity is limited, is looking to bonded warehouses or foreign trade zones where you can kind of get your goods landed in the US, but not through customs. And then in the hope that at some stage that tariff will come down. And instead of having to wait the 2 or 3 weeks it takes to get across the Pacific, the good is there and you can stamp the date and off you go. But we don't know. And yes, coming down from 145% is great, but it has to come quite far down before you really want to start doing this again.
Yeah, but I mean, they're going to have to do something, shippers, though, aren't they?
Yep.
They can't. I know that they've said that we're going to adopt a wait and see approach, but at some point, they're going to have to, even if it stays at 145% tariff, they're going to have to do something, whether that's swallow the 145% or scenario plan about, I know it's a much more difficult thing to do, whether it is shifting supply chains into Vietnam or wherever else it is. They can't wait and see forever, can they? Otherwise, they're not going to have any goods coming into the US.
Yes, that doesn't make it any easier to make that decision.
No.
Clearly, at the moment, we are seeing looking towards the rest of the region and other countries to kind of make up for China, on top of just the front loading of actual imports from those countries that you already had established.
Yeah, so going back to the question though, they're going to have to do something eventually. They have to, otherwise the kind of business doesn't exist, does it? In terms of the trade flows. So do you think if businesses are increasing imports and putting them in the free trade zones or bonded zones, and they're sending goods into boxes into Vancouver in the hope that they can then put them into US, do you think that suggests some kind of we must suggest some kind of confidence that the tariffs, even if they don't go completely, are going to come down to a more palatable level that would allow them to import them into the US?
Either that, and I think that's what's most likely, or just having that availability. So maybe instead of taking a month's worth of goods, you take 3 months. Then okay, maybe there's a week or two where shelves are empty, where you're really waiting out and saying, I still want to wait until those tariffs fall. But at the end of the day, actually, the shelves are empty. I need the goods. The tariffs are going nowhere. I need to import it. It just means you can delay making that decision because you have that extra flexibility. But I think we seem to be hearing more and more warnings about empty shelves, and we're already talking about Christmas goods.
Yeah.
Which to me is the kind of thing you need to be talking about to get a reaction from the administration, right? You need to make it clear that this is very painful for US shippers, for US companies, and US consumers to kind of push that reaction. So there's maybe an extent of let's show them how bad it is to kind of push them down the other way. But I'm not going to accuse anybody of anything.
No, but there's nothing like a Christmas story to kind of up the ante of external pressure, is there? Because if you remember, it was May last year. When we had all the congestion building in Singapore and in the Mediterranean because of the Red Sea crisis and all of the kind of stories in the press and externally, and when it kind of cut through to your kind of international mainstream press, it was about shippers are already front loading Christmas goods. That's the thing that kind of really kind of
don't mess with our Christmas.
Don't mess with our Christmas.
Absolutely.
Christmas. No. Okay. Just another question before we move on to the next topic. Does this kind of show that I'm going to put the actual overall landed import costs to one side because the tariffs are going to obviously send that skywards. But in terms of, if we just concentrate purely on the freight rates, does this emphasize the fact that there are two sides to the coin? So yes, if you're importing into from China directly into the US West Coast, there's going to be upward pressure. But actually, if you're a shipper that is, for example, on the transatlantic, for example, your freight rates are going to come down, aren't they?
That's what you're hoping, yes. And not just because of extra capacity from the Trans-Pacific and Far East to Europe to US trade, but also because we have the same 10% tariff there with the threat of a much higher. So there's one thing about, okay, where the ship's going, but there is also a question about the underlying demand. And we talk a lot about China, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact and demand of this just 10% tariff. But more importantly, what we're looking at for early July, should those tariffs come back, and of course that's should with capital letters, but that's a big difference. So yes, there's a question mark there, but we need a lot more information about what happens on I think it's the 9th of July, to see there how does that respond, and how much have shippers from these other countries front loaded in this 3-month window they've been given. Because that's another side to the story. If you look at why blank sailings and why freight rates are relatively flat, it's partly also because there is higher volumes out of the rest of the region. Not enough by any means to make up for the drop out of China, but some that helps carriers keep those ships a little bit more full. And it's potentially also why we're seeing a larger share of capacity being blanked into the US West Coast, which is much more heavily impacted by Chinese volumes, than into the East Coast, where you get a slightly more balanced picture.
Yeah. And just say, we just done exactly what we said we kind of shouldn't do at the start of the podcast, which is to almost downplay the 10%, didn't we? We say, oh, well, it might come down anywhere from 145% back down to somewhere in between 10%. Well, that 10%, if we use our example earlier about the business importing tools from Europe, that 10% added another $250,000 onto their costs. So you're right. There's a danger here, isn't it, of us saying 10% is, a good situation. It's still something that's going to hit businesses really hard, isn't it? We can't lose sight of that fact, can we?
No, absolutely not. And I think those looks a little bit more set and less likely to disappear than some of the other reciprocal tariffs, and with these expectations of a drop in tariffs from China. But 10% is still a lot, especially when it's basically all US imports with some few exceptions.
So very quickly, last thing, what's going to happen to spot rates next month, 2 months?
I think they've continued to fall. I think, to me, there's a big question mark as to how far carriers are willing to go with blank sailings, especially when we look now at the new alliances, each trying to figure out their market share. And like you said, with COVID, we had a relatively limited period. And of course, we didn't know it at the time what would happen. But it was really an extraordinary situation that all carriers were responding to something they've never seen before. Yes, that's what's happening again now. But if it becomes a little bit more structural and those tariffs stick around, then they are going to start competing for market share. And it only takes one or two of them to start pulling those rates down to all the others are doing it. And that would then suggest spot rates would be pulled down quite quickly. So it's also that question mark of how are carriers willing to compete and what are they willing to do in this situation?
Sounds like
no easy answer.
No, but it sounds like a topic for our next rate debate, doesn't it? How low will rates go and how low can they go so that carriers can actually make it sustainable, I suppose, for their business. Okay. Tariffs done.
Easy.
Well, easy for us, not so easy for the shippers dealing with it, I suppose. Right. Topic number 2 on this episode of the Freight Debate is the Ships for America Act, which I must confess I didn't really know anything about until you flagged it this week, because it's come to the fore, hasn't it? Do you want to set the scene a little bit of why this is another unwelcome and probably unexpected headache for shippers?
So it was a bill introduced in Congress back in December last year, so it kind of predates the Trump administration. And the basic idea is the same as what we were seeing with the Port Acts, that they want to boost domestic shipbuilding in the US, get more cargo moved on those ships, and kind of push back on what they would see in particular with China, but also in other cargo types. If you're looking at LNG or car carriers or other goods, not container, this is kind of a broader push to get more ships built in the US and more US crew and US flagged ships. For container shipping, the changes that were made when it was reintroduced last week, as you said, there are 2 big things I want to focus on for container shipping. There's a whole load of this bill that is specifically targeted on how we boost shipbuilding, how we boost crew numbers. But for container shipping, I think there's 2 parts that are relevant. The first one is a new set of port fees, which is just what we were looking forward to. And the second one is some requirements on how large a share of your imports from China have to be moved on a US ship. So if we just start with that second one, and we say this one is still a shipper's responsibility. So it becomes a little bit like tariffs, whereas the port fees are more carriers having to respond and pay.
Yeah.
But this regulation would say the first year, 1% of your imports from China, and that's across all goods, but for container shipping particularly relevant, have to be moved on US ships, flagged, built. Now, there are some US built ships, but they are incredibly expensive to build and to run and to keep them flagged. So that is a sort of an extra fee that shippers would have to build, firstly to pay to get the cargo moved on those ships, because this regulation would suddenly add a lot of demand, even if it's just 1% and there's not that many of those ships. But also just the practicalities of, okay, where do I find this ship? How much of my volumes were actually moved there? Am I clear? And that is then a requirement that would increase year by year until you get to around 15% in the 14th year.
But how can that be kind of worked in the real world? Because let's say you're a shipper and you want to move your boxes on, Ocean Alliance, for example. Can you say, I specifically want my box moved on that ship? Or is it up to the alliance to say, we will move your box from A to B at the time that you're requesting us to move it, but they're going to move it on the ship that makes sense to them, aren't they? Whether that's US flag.
They would in normal conditions, but if this becomes a real piece of legislation that they have to abide by, with the risk of a penalty if you don't, that's when you have to start looking, okay, how do we set this up? Does it become, what comes to mind here is Maersk's, they have, and a couple of other carriers have this biofuel project that you say, I want to pay to go on a biofuel ship, right? You're paying for this extra service to say, this is the rate I pay. I'm going to pay you an extra couple of $100, maybe $1,000 because I need a share of my volumes on those ships. Or, and perhaps an easier one to get to, is you say, I'm going to move 1% of my volumes on these Matson ships, and Matson guarantees that it's a US flagship because that's what they have a lot of in their fleet. Because this is, the result of the Jones Act in the US that says cargo moving within the US has to be moved on US built and flagged ships. So they have some of those ships already because they run quite a lot of services out to Hawaii, but they also run exports out of the Far East into the US. So they would have some of that capability, which presumably either you make it a direct agreement with your usual carrier, get it on the right ship, or you say, I'm taking 1% of my volumes and putting it on a Matson ship instead.
Yeah.
But it's tricky. It's just another thing that you have to kind of be aware of and take into consideration.
Yeah. So could we look at the other aspects of the Ships for America Act, which is the order book, isn't it?
It's the order book, and it's a return a little bit to targeting some of these Chinese carriers. In this piece of legislation, there's one term that becomes quite important, and that is this foreign shipyard of concern. And at the moment, that seems to be designated as CSSC, Chinese State Shipbuilding Corporation, which has quite a few yards in China, and it's really looking at that. So again, we're back similar to where the new USTR proposal, which we discussed previously, is this fee per net ton of your ship's capacity. It's the same thing coming back in. The first target is for US, or rather for Chinese carriers and operators, and that's saying $5 per net ton. So that's on top of the $18 per net ton that we're talking about for the USTR fees come October. But that just hits your Chinese operators. The next one that comes in is, as you say, this order book, and it looks into all carriers and how much of their order book they have at these CSSC yards. It's a return. I think one of the reasons that the new or the reviewed USTR port fees was sort of seen as a step forward compared to the first proposal was that you moved away from considering your carrier's order book, because that was part of the original deal, which meant that Maersk, Hapag, any of these carriers, they were going to be hit every time they called the US because of this order book. And that was removed. So now those carriers and those non-Chinese carriers only get hit when they send a US or a Chinese built ship. We're going back to that first version, and it's a much lower fee, but it's back to saying if you as a carrier have a share of your order book at these CSSC yards, you're going to get a fee whenever you come to the US, and there's not very much you can do about it. Now, it's a much smaller share. We're not looking now at the whole order book in China. We're looking only at these CSSC yards. So fewer carriers get hit, but they're still getting hit. And I think in particular, you look at a carrier like CMA, they would be facing $3.50 per ton when they come in. And that links back a little bit. We had the discussion last time about the Ocean Alliance being particularly hard hit, with COSCO kind of really being hit hard by these regulations, CMA and Evergreen needing to step up. But CMA is now among the carriers most hit by this, and suddenly that they have an extra fee whenever they call, regardless of what ship it is, which just adds again and makes it even more complicated for that alliance to work away and work around how they want to be sending ships to the US.
So basically, if their solution to the USTR port fees is to send CMA ships that are non-Chinese built, but basically CMA ships on the US trades and use the COSCO ships elsewhere, yes, that's going to avoid the USTR fees, but it ain't going to avoid the Ships for America fees, is it?
No, and I mean, to be fair, the fees would be much lower. We're talking about a couple of $100,000 for the largest ships calling in the US, but a cost is the cost, and that is something shippers are going to have to be, well, the carriers are going to try and pass on to the shippers, and we'll see how successful that is.
Can I put my cynical hat back on?
Absolutely.
This order book fee, order book based fee, was in the original USTR proposal. Then he went to a public hearing, and there was a huge outcry against it. And one of the concessions in the subsequent USTR proposal was the removal of the order book, and now it's been added in to something that's completely separate to the USTR, but essentially the same fee. So it does feel a little bit like they've said, yes, we're giving you with one hand and taking away with the other. Why else would they not have just kept it in the USTR proposal?
I'm going to let you have that one. I don't fully disagree. And you say it's fully separate. I'm pretty sure when I looked at it that actually the revenue collected from these two proposals, the USTR and this latest one, would go to the same place. So it's not entirely separate.
If you're a shipper,
yes,
what are you going to do now? This is another. You've got the tariffs. I mean, I think we need to kind of keep the tariffs separate to the freight costs, don't we? Because they are a bit of a different animal, aren't they? We're looking at the freight. We're looking purely at the freight costs now. We've got the port fees, and we've got now these additional Ships for America Act fees. What do you do if you're a shipper in these scenarios? Because it feels like the situation is being made as difficult administratively as much as anything else they could possibly can be. So if you're a shipper, what kind of advice would you put over to them?
I think there's a tendency at the moment that you're looking at tariffs and it's so all-encompassing that you're not thinking forward to these things, because yes, the USTR fees, they're only going to be coming in October, and there's a long way to October. We have no idea what the tariff situation will be like then, and then this Ships for America, the prospects look a little bit longer term. But I think to us, it's clear that you need to have these in the back of your mind when you're going through it. You need to have those discussions with your carrier. How do we, if I'm signing a 12-month contract today, yes, the fees aren't in place now, but they will be within that contract. So do we have in place a mechanism that you can say this is a valid surcharge and we can clearly show you the backup costs? Just have a way that actually it's built in and you have it in the contract, so you can say, okay, this would trigger and you get renegotiation, or if this should happen, then we're willing to look at it. Because I think at the moment the costs aren't going to increase, right? There's a delay on those, but you can't just put your head in the sand and say, I can't deal with anything other than tariffs, even though that's clearly a attractive option these days. Or attractive, I don't think is the right word, but
yeah. But if you've got the port fees, if this order, it's just using this as an example, if the order book fees were included in the USTR proposal, from a kind of a surcharge point of view, maybe it would be easier, would it not? Because you've got one regulation to be dealing with and one regulation to be looking at. If you're looking at surcharges, would a carrier could presumably label the surcharges? I suppose you could label it a peak season surcharge or whatever, whatever they wanted. It just makes it more complicated, doesn't it? To track and what are you pushing back on? USTR? You're pushing back on Ships for America Act? Are you pushing back on peak season surcharges, Red Sea surcharges? It's just really, really difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's maybe too far to say this Ships Act mean the changes to the original port fees is irrelevant, because if you were looking back then, it's now maybe $200,000-$300,000 for non-Chinese operators they get hit, compared to $1 million, which was hitting a lot more carriers. So it's not the same scale, but agreed, it's all at the end of the day, a carrier's cost base is the total of what they're looking at, and you as a shipper need to be able to say to your carrier, actually, I know that you're not particularly hard hit by this, so why are you charging the same surcharge as Costco, who's going to hit with millions of dollars? But that's clearly kind of, carriers will, maybe now it's my turn to be cynical, but we see it with bunker surcharges, we see it with other surcharges, that it's not easy to track how the cost base actually impacts that surcharge, even if it's called the bunker fuel surcharge. And I wouldn't expect that to change this time around. So as a shipper, you really need to be on your toes and have a minimal idea of how your carrier is going to be hit and how you want to play it. You want to choose another carrier because you believe that it will be a cheaper option because they avoid these fees.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we've covered Ships for America Act. They're the two main topics for this episode of the Freight Debate. We've covered the rate, the impact on rates of the US tariffs, and we've covered the port fees, and Ships for America Act. One question, Emily, before we go: do you think we're going to have some good news for shippers in the next episode of the Freight Debate? Because it feels like it's we're just kind of the harbingers of doom. Kind of every episode, we're bringing them more bad news, aren't we? Do you think we might have some kind of blue skies on the horizon at any point, or are we set for grey clouds for the rest of 2025?
I think we will have some good news, but it might be one of those new situations where it's better than was currently the time, but if it had started here, it wasn't great. So if we say that there is a reduction in Chinese tariffs to even 50%, that will be good news, but it's still not great. So I can't be fully optimistic on that front.
No. Well, at least it gives us a way to promote our next episodes. If there's any shippers that are sick of the bad news, next episode we'll try and give you some good news. So if that's not an incentive to watch and listen to the next episode of the Freight Debate, I don't know what is. So, Emily, thank you again for your expert insights. That's a wrap, I think. Unless you've got anything else to add to the...
No, I think let's leave it on that teaser for good news next time.
That's our challenge for the next Freight Debate. Good news. We'll bring some good news.
Perfect.
Okay. Well, if you want to hear some good news, if we can, fingers crossed, then join us for the next Freight Debate. Hit subscribe, join us again, and let's move the industry forward together. Thank you.